Welcome to the Private School Leader Podcast, where private school leaders learn how to thrive and not just survive as they serve and lead their schools. I strongly believe that it is possible to have a long and happy and fulfilling career as a private school leader. And my passion is to help you figure out exactly how to do just that right here on the Private School Leader Podcast. And I'm your host, Mark Minkus. So to start today's episode, I want you to use your imagination. And I want you to imagine that you're going to a conference in another city, and there's a couple of colleagues with you, whether they're from your leadership team or they're teachers. So let's just say it's you and 3 other people from your school, and you're going to this conference in another city, but you're going a day early so that you can visit 2 private schools on the day before the conference. And you're going to visit one private school in the morning and one private school in the afternoon. So in the morning, you visit a big private school with a beautiful campus and a reputation for strong academics and high test scores and a beautiful sign out front. And on paper, like, this looks like a dream school. It's like, wow, super impressive. But within about 10 minutes of you walking the halls, it feels like something's off. No one greeted you when you arrived. The front office staff barely looked up. Teachers kept their doors closed, and the students even seemed kind of like unusually quiet, like with their heads down, just kind of going from one place to the other. And you're thinking as you visit this school during the morning that, well, this place is pretty impressive, but it doesn't feel alive. So you go to lunch with your colleagues from your school, and then in the afternoon, you visit a much smaller school just across town in this city that you're visiting. And you visit this much smaller school, and it has older buildings and fewer resources, and the lobby is not fancy. But the moment you walk in, a 3rd grader is running past, and you hear her yelling, "We're having music in the hallway today." And you're greeted warmly by the office staff, and a teacher smiles and waves from her doorway. A student opens the door for you, and he asks you if you need help finding anyone. And you hear laughter from the staff lounge when you walk past. And the principal of the school, at the end of the day when you're getting ready to leave, he's outside on dismissal duty, and he's high-fiving every kid who is coming out the door to head to their cars in carpool. So 2 private schools, same city, but 2 totally different schools, 2 totally different vibes. And so what made the difference? Well, the answer is culture, and a culture that's created on purpose and not by accident. And on today's episode of the Private School Leader Podcast, we are going to discuss the 6 keys to significantly improving the culture at your school. But just before we jump into that, I just wanted to let you know that over the past few weeks, probably about 15 private school leaders across America have purchased Parent Academy so that they can use it as part of their teacher in service in August. And as you probably have heard me say before, Parent Academy contains 4 teaching modules where I teach you a framework to be less anxious and stressed and to feel calm and confident when you're working with the parents at your school. But then after I teach you, the Parent Academy contains 2 45-minute webinars that are teacher PDs, and there's a 27-page printable workbook that has guided notes and discussion questions. And many leaders use these in the spring, for these PDs in the spring, for a PD day or a faculty meeting. And like I said, about 15 or so have purchased that, and they're going to use it as part of their teacher in service. And so the 45-minute webinar, teachers are writing in their guided notes, and then afterwards, they're getting into small groups to discuss it. And now you have this foundation for proactive teacher communication to build better relationships with the parents at your school. And wouldn't that be an amazing way to start your school year? So there's still time, and you can go to the privateschoolleader.com/parent academy to learn more. And there's some testimonials there from leaders who've used the PDs and teachers as well. And so I think it could be a game changer for your school. So just really check that out at the privateschoolleader.com/parent academy. And, some of you have been listening to the podcast from the beginning. This is episode 143. And I just want to say thank you for listening. And I want to give you a free gift. And it's called the 7 Steps to Having Successful Meetings with Upset Parents. And this guide is an 11-page PDF that will give you a step-by-step plan to have better meetings with the parents at your school. And every good coach has a game plan. Every good teacher has a lesson plan. But I think that too many private school leaders don't have a plan when they sit down to meet with an upset parent. Well, now you have a plan, and you can go to the privateschoolleader.com/meeting to grab your free guide, the 7 Steps to Having Successful Meetings with Upset Parents. That's the privateschoolleader.com/meeting. And I was going to ask for a favor. Wherever you listen to this podcast, if you would go and please write a review and rate the podcast. Just take a couple minutes to please do that. If you wouldn't mind, I'd really appreciate it, because that helps the algorithm push this podcast out as suggested content for leaders all over the world. Just this past week, we added Bulgaria as a place where the podcast has been downloaded, and now it's in 67 countries in all 50 states. And it's pretty cool that there's leaders in Bulgaria and Mongolia and other places that are listening and applying what we learn here in their schools. But the way that they can find it is that algorithm pushing it out. And the way that you can help that happen is to write a review and rate the podcast wherever you listen. So I'd really, really appreciate it if you would do that. So I want to let you know up front that this podcast episode, the 6 Keys to Significantly Improving the Culture at Your School, that I'm splitting it into 2 parts. And this is part 1, because if we want to intentionally build or intentionally improve the culture at our school, there's going to be some work. There's going to be a lot of work and a lot of intention. But there's a lot to cover here, and 6 keys, and I also actually have 2 prerequisites before you get started. That's just too much for one episode, so you'll get part 1 today, and you'll get part 2 in episode 144. I'll take good care of you in the show notes at theprivateschoolleader.com/episode 143. And so maybe just listen. I know that you're usually multitasking when you listen, and I am glad that you're doing that. But I want to talk about how you can tangibly, specifically, what you can actually do to improve the culture at your school. I know that we think about it, we talk about it, and maybe we, especially for me, when I would visit other schools earlier in my career, and I'd be like, oh man, this culture is awesome. I wish I had that culture at my school. But it's like, how do we go from wishing to actually turning that into something that we can see and touch and hear at our schools? And so I'm going to help you with that today, and then also next week on the podcast. And so I mentioned that I want to start with 2 prerequisites. So before we even get into the 6 keys, there are 2 things that are essential for you to do. All right. Prerequisite number 1 is for you to see it clearly. So when I say see it clearly, I mean to actually envision the culture that you want at your school. And so the problem with that is that we spend so much time looking at what's 6 inches in front of our face and what's latest and loudest and what's urgent, and playing whack-a-mole with our hair on fire. And it just is so hard to envision something that we want that's big and that's in the future, because we're so distracted by what's right in front of us. And so I don't want you to focus on the complaining teacher or the 7th grade boy's behavior or that parent that sent you the email in all caps with an exclamation point. But I want you to envision and see it clearly. And it's like, okay, well, how am I going to do that? All right, I'm going to give you a framework to do that. And again, I'll put this in the show notes so you don't have to try to remember all this, but we're going to do what's called the 5 senses activity. And what you're going to do is you're going to take a notebook. You could take your laptop. I prefer for something like this to just write stuff down. But take a notebook or take your laptop with an open, empty Google Doc, and you're going to hide. And what I mean by that is that if you're going to do this on campus, that especially if you're listening in real time, which is early to mid-July, but whenever you listen to this episode, this is something that either, if you're going to do it at school, you don't do it in your office because you're going to get interrupted, or this might actually be something that you do on a weeknight or a weekend and just kind of find a spot where you're not going to be interrupted. So you've got your notebook or your Google Doc, you've got your location where you won't be interrupted, and I want you to envision your school's ideal culture. And the reason that most schools don't have an ideal culture is because the leader never took the time to envision what does an ideal culture at my school look like. And so you're going to take this notebook and you're going to just draw 5 squares, or you're going to use 5 separate pages or whatever, and you're going to just label each of those squares or each of those pages with each of the senses. See, hear, touch, smell, taste. See, hear, touch, smell, taste. Okay, so then let's just say you start with what you see. And you're going to imagine, for me, it helps to close my eyes and eliminate those distractions and just envision and imagine your ideal culture at your school. What do you see? You see smiles, you see engaged kids doing interesting things, you see students and teachers displaying a growth mindset, you see evidence of high teacher morale, you see an inviting entryway, you see a clean campus. I think we focus too much on the size of our campus and the age of our buildings. We can have a clean and inviting campus regardless of the age or size. What do you see? All the things that you would see, and you just do this brain dump and just start writing down this magic wand. You wave a magic wand over your school, and these would be all the things that you would see in your ideal culture. And then you move on to hear. What do you hear? You hear laughter. You hear teachers teaching and inspiring kids. You hear a teacher having a one-on-one conversation with a kid in the hallway. You hear music on Wednesday morning in the hallway. And let me just take a brief aside and tell you what I mean. At the Jewish day school where I worked for 12 years, it just kind of happened because one more Wednesday morning we were announcing the spring musical, Frozen Junior. And so as the kids came upstairs to the 3rd floor, we had these speakers, and we were blasting the music for Frozen Junior as a way to announce the musical with all of these posters that were hung up that said Frozen Junior. But the kids were really into it, and so my science teacher said, well, why don't we just have music in the hallway every Wednesday morning and just have a dance party? And it's like, okay. So then for the next, my last 2 years there, and they're still doing it, it would be the kind of music that you can imagine that would get kids going in the morning. That music on Wednesday morning in the middle school hallway was part of our culture in the middle school. And so, again, what are you hearing in your ideal culture? And then you move on to touch. What are you touching? You're touching a bench in the outdoor classroom. You're touching the something you're touching a flower that's planted by the main entrance. You're touching the new computer in the computer room, or you're touching something in the gym. What are things that you can actually touch? You're touching the kiln or the clay or the fired in the kiln clay that becomes ceramic art in the art room. What are you touching? And then what are you smelling? I mentioned the flower. You're smelling the flowers in the landscaping at the main entrance. You're smelling popcorn at the spring outdoor carnival. You're smelling the varnish or wax or on the clean floors, or the varnish on the gym floor. What are you smelling, and then what are you tasting? You're tasting the delicious, healthy food in the lunchroom. You're tasting a hot dog at the basketball game. So this five senses activity with your notebook or your open Google Doc, prerequisite number one is to see it clearly. Before you do anything, you've got to envision, what does the ideal culture look like at my school? Okay. Then prerequisite number two is to read your guiding documents. So you're going to read your mission statement. You're going to read your vision statement if you have one. You're going to read your portrait of a graduate if you have one. And these are your guiding documents. These are your North Star. This is when you get into your car and you and your family are going somewhere you've never been before, and so whether you pull out your phone or you have it on the dash of your car and it asks for destination, this is what you punch in, is where you're going. Well, your mission statement, your vision statement, your portrait of a graduate, that's your destination on your GPS. That's your North Star. Those are your guiding documents. But then I want you to, after you read them, I want you to ask yourself two big questions. Question number one is, are we in alignment? And then question number two is, do we need to change our practice or our documents? So let's say you ask, are we in alignment? And you're like, well, no, in these certain areas. So then something has to change. Either your practice at the school has drifted away from those guiding documents and you need to change how you do school or how you do certain things. So you're going to change your practice. Or maybe your school has outgrown those old guiding documents, and that really isn't accurate anymore about the mission statement or about the portrait of a graduate. And so I'm not saying that at this point, especially if you're listening to this and it's like mid-July, that, okay, well, now is the time to change our mission statement or to change our portrait of a graduate. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that that's something that you think about and may make some notes on and then come back to it. But you don't have to have your documents to be changed in order for you to significantly improve the culture at your school. But it is an important, in my opinion, an important prerequisite to read your guiding documents and then to ask yourself, are we in alignment? And if the answer is no, then you ask the second question, do we need to change our practice or do we need to change our documents? And then you jot some things down and you can always come back to that. Okay, so then that's going to bring us to key number one. And key number one is to be the thermostat, not the thermometer. Be the thermostat, not the thermometer. So as you know, in your home, the thermostat is the thing that sets the temperature. And it regulates it, it influences it, it controls the temperature in your home. And if you want to set it at a certain number, let's just pick 70 degrees. And if it's 30 degrees outside, then your furnace is going to kick on and it's going to make sure your home is 70 degrees. But if it's 92 degrees outside, hopefully you have air conditioning. As a person who grew up without air conditioning and who loves air conditioning now, if your home is set at 70 degrees and it's 92 degrees outside, you're really hoping that AC kicks on. So as you know, the thermostat sets the temperature. But a thermometer just records or reflects or displays the temperature of the environment. It tells you what's happening. It reacts to the temperature and just shows you the temperature on the thermometer. And so I want to ask you a question. When it comes to the culture of your school, you as a leader at your school, are you the thermostat or are you the thermometer? So the thermostat leader, when it comes to culture, is the one that's influencing and changing and envisioning and tweaking and making sure that the culture is what you envision it to be, in what you see and hear and touch is actually evidence of the culture that you want. It's about intention. You're setting the temperature, you're setting the culture. Or are you a thermometer when it comes to your culture, and you're just kind of going with the flow, and you see stuff that's happening, and then you just kind of react to it and try to put out fires, and there's not really intention behind it as much as there's reacting behind it, and you're just kind of displaying, well, this is what the temperature is. Like, it is what it is. That's one of my least favorite statements. So we want to be the thermostat and not the thermometer. And, you know, I think that thermometer leaders, quote unquote, they are like I said, they react and they just kind of report, so to speak, and they don't really control. I think that they tend to mirror and match the emotions and the energy of their staff and their students. If there's tension, they get tense. If morale is low, they get discouraged. You know, they're reacting and sort of quote unquote reporting what is going on in the culture. But a thermostat leader is the one that's like setting the tone. They bring calm if things are chaotic. They model optimism and certainty if things feel uncertain. They are ones who lead with integrity, and they lead with empathy, and they if there's a tragedy in the school or a big difficulty, then they're the one that is looked to as the leader, that everything's going to be okay. They create the culture rather than just like absorb the culture. Does that make sense? So we want to be the thermostat, not the thermometer, when it comes to the culture in our school. And it's like, okay, so I kind of get that you're saying, I want to be the thermostat. So how do I do that? Okay, I'm going to give you 2 ways to become a thermostat leader when it comes to culture. The first is the way you act, and then number 2 is the way you speak. So let's just spend a minute on the way you act. So I want you to model the mood that you want to see. Okay, do you want there to be joy in your school? Then bring joy to your school every single day. Do you want optimism? Then be optimistic. Do you want professionalism? Then show up on time, prepared, dressed professionally, speaking and writing professionally, and be consistent. Do you want teachers and students to act with integrity? Then act with integrity. Do you want psychological safety in your school? Then show up with a predictable mood and tell the truth. Do you want more school spirit? Then dress up on theme days, even if you don't like doing that and it makes you feel uncomfortable. Do you want less negativity? Then be more positive. You know, your emotional state, the way you act and the way you feel / model your feelings and display your feelings, your emotional state is contagious. So if you're calm, if you're confident, if you project clarity, that's going to spread. But if you're scattered and stressed and anxious and dysregulated and don't have a predictable mood and kind of, snap at people, or just, you go from this mood to that mood or whatever, that emotional state is contagious also. So when it comes to how to be a thermostat leader and to control the culture, the first way is the way that you act, and then the second is the way that you speak. So we just really need to be very intentional about the language that we use, and we need to talk about. Okay, let me be careful about how I say this. I think that sometimes, I'll speak for myself, and maybe if this is true to you, for you, you can apply it to yourself. But instead of focusing on what's wrong, we need to spend more time talking about what our school is becoming. So let me say that again. Instead of just focusing on everything that's wrong with the school, we need to talk more, in my opinion, we need to talk more about what your school is becoming. And then we want to reinforce our key values. So he's like, well, how do I do that? Okay. Well, if you want collaboration, then you start saying things, you start using the word we a lot. At our school, we do this, we do that. Very, very few I statements. I think as a leader, You use I statements when you say, well, I made this decision, when you know it's a difficult decision. And that's when I used to try to hide behind we. Well, we as the admin, this vague thing. Well, several of us had a conversation and we decided blah, blah, blah. And it's like, I decided, and I'm hiding behind the word we. Don't use the word we when it's a difficult decision that you think people aren't going to like, but then overuse the word we when it comes to you describing values or successes or things that we do at our school. At our school, we, ... okay? The way you speak. We're going to celebrate wins. We're going to give shout outs, even little ones. We're going to acknowledge and recognize people. We're going to intentionally encourage people. All of this tells your team we're in this together. This is the culture that we're creating together. And the way you speak, talk about the culture. That vision that you have on that 5 senses activity, it's like once you get some clarity around like what you see, then start talking about it with other people and get them excited and get them to catch that vision. And at first you might get a lot of cynicism and pushback and eye rolls and body language and this and that, but you're not going to be deterred by that. You're going to be inspired that you're the one that's going to take them there. You're the thermostat. You're setting the temperature. You're setting the culture. And so the way to do that, the way to be the thermostat and not the thermometer, is the way you act and the way you speak. And then that brings us to key number 2. And actually key number 2 is going to be our last key today. And then next week we're going to do keys 3 through 6. Key number 2 is to climb the pyramid. Now, the pyramid that I'm talking about is, I want you to think back to Psych 101 when you talked about Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And you can envision this pyramid. I'll put the image in the show notes. But at the bottom, you have your physiological needs for food, water, rest, shelter. And then up from that, you have your safety needs, security, safety. So those 2 levels are your basic needs. Then you move up to your psychological needs, like belongingness and love, esteem needs. And then at the top of the pyramid is self-actualization. So I know you can kind of picture that in your mind about the hierarchy of needs, Abraham Maslow. So I strongly believe that key number 2 to building the culture you want at your school is to move your school up the pyramid. So if your teachers and your students and your parents are down clinging on to the bottom at their physiological needs or their safety needs, the way to have a better culture is to move those people up the pyramid into belongingness, love, esteem. Wouldn't it be great if we could visit self-actualization every once in a while? But I think that too many of our schools that we're down around the bottom of this pyramid, and there's all the complaining and the finger pointing, and I'm upset about this and I'm upset about that, and we're reacting and we're focused on what's right in front of us, but we're not building certain things and we're not moving up the pyramid. We're going to climb this pyramid. So how do I move my team and my students up the pyramid? Okay, there's 2 ways. We're going to build psychological safety, and we're going to build a sense of belonging. And you'll notice when I talk about this for a couple minutes that there is a lot of overlap in building psychological safety and building a sense of belonging. But specifically, how am I going to move my people up the pyramid? Okay, first, we're going to build psychological safety. So Amy Edmondson, she's a Harvard professor. She is credited with coining the term psychological safety several years ago. And she says that psychological safety is a term that describes organizations with open and honest communication that allow employees to have a sense of comfort about their ideas and identities at work. People feel safe to bring their whole self to work and the ability to share their feelings without repercussion, judgment, or fear of retaliation, end quote. So that's a mouthful, but I think you get the idea of psychological safety. That it's showing up at work, feeling physically and psychologically safe to be able to be yourself, to share your feelings, to contribute and collaborate without worrying about, replication socially or judgment or some kind of retaliation. And I get it. I know our private schools have all different kinds of employment models, from everyone being an at-will employee to one-year contracts to multi-year contracts. And so some of that, might not feel psychologically safe, just like the structure of the quote-unquote security of the employment arrangement. But the level of, or perceived level of, psychological safety at your school is usually tied to teacher morale at your school. And we'll get to teacher morale later in one of the keys. I think actually one of the later keys is to improve teacher morale, and I'll help you with that. But if we want to build psychological safety at our school, how do we do that? So I'm just going to give you a couple of these things, and I'll make sure they're in the show notes. But first, we're going to accept responsibility for the psychological safety of every person on our campus. Now, it's a no-brainer that we're accepting as leaders the responsibility for the physical safety of every person on our campus, but we need to take that a step further. And if we recognize that psychological safety contributes significantly to the emotional well-being of our teachers and makes burnout less likely and helps kids learn, they're more likely to learn and have higher, better effort, but also higher test scores, and all of the research that supports that kids learn better when they feel psychologically and physically safe at school. So we're recognizing that, we're accepting responsibility for it. And then we're also noticing or recognizing that our teachers and kids are less stressed and less anxious, and that we have better mental health, we have better physical health, we have higher job satisfaction, we have higher retention rates. Like, psychological safety isn't just about building a better culture. It's about things that impact the bottom line. It's about hanging on to good teachers. It's about having families stay in the school until their kid graduates. And so, how are we going to do that? Well, with teachers, we're encouraging our teachers to be open and honest. Well, how are our teachers going to be honest and vulnerable and ask for feedback? Well, there's a lot of mistrust between teachers and administration, and that's something that we can work on. But asking for feedback, gathering that feedback, analyzing it, sharing it back to the teachers, acting on that, following up on it, the feedback loop, actually doing a feedback loop, not just asking for it and then the results never are shared back with the teachers. Feedback loops help to build psychological safety. And another big thing, and I'm mainly talking about the teachers here, we could spend a whole nother time talking about creating psychological safety for students, but I think that our schools, many of us need to make sure that we have guidelines for respectful communication. And that these guidelines should be in effect in all interactions, teacher to teacher, at meetings or in the hallway, teacher to parent, admin to teacher, teacher to student. We cringe when we walk by or we hear about that teacher that's being overly stern with that student, and you see that student's body language. And then we think, oh, well, that's just Mr. So-and-so. He's old school. Okay. Is it old school? Is that student psychologically safe? So guidelines for respectful communication, that's where ChatGPT can give you an assist. And then for this next one as well, ChatGPT can give you an assist. Create and follow a short set of meeting norms for your team meetings and faculty meetings. So it's it could be, we don't interrupt. We use I statements, not you statements. We judge favorably and we stay curious. Just having 3 or 4 meeting norms for all team meetings and for all faculty meetings. And we're going to have them posted, or we're going to read them quickly at the beginning of the meeting. Hey, just as a reminder, our meeting norms are, ... Those can really build a lot of psychological safety, because there's some stars in your school that have amazing ideas that keep their mouth shut because they're worried about the eye rolls and the body language that are going to come from the more veteran teacher that is the one that everyone knows is prickly and they want to avoid. So are you going to have the uncomfortable conversation with that veteran teacher with the body language, or are you going to lose that star teacher 2 years from now because they don't feel psychologically safe at your school? And I know that sucks to hear that. And I know, and I want to just admit that earlier in my career, I didn't handle those situations well. But after losing the stars and hanging on to the old school people, I started to get more proactive with that. And so, again, I just want to kind of give you a little courage, try and remind you when you don't have the confidence, reach for the courage when it comes to the necessity to have that conversation so that you're creating psychological safety for everybody. So we're talking about climbing the pyramid. If we want to build a better culture in our school, and how do we move people up the pyramid? We are going to build psychological safety. Okay. And then we're going to build a sense of belonging. So why is that so important? Well, it's not just nice to have a sense of belonging in your school. I think we need to think about this as a non-negotiable. I'm going to say that again. It's not just a thing that's nice to have in your school, a sense of belonging. It should be a non-negotiable that there's a sense of belonging in your school if you want to have a better culture. So for students, that sense of belonging is usually pretty closely linked to emotional well-being and behavior towards each other and academic success and, being a part of this homeroom and this grade or this team or so on. And then for teachers, having a sense of belonging is very closely linked to their job satisfaction, their retention, how much they collaborate. And again, that kind of harkens back to what we talked about with psychological safety. But for the families at your school, we want them to have a sense of belonging too, because I haven't talked much about the parents or the families, but families stay at schools where they feel a sense of belonging. And some schools want to keep families, parents, at arm's length distance and only see them on back to school night, parent-teacher conferences, and, maybe at a parent association event in the spring. And that's it. We don't want those families on campus. Okay. But what are we doing to have that sense of belonging for the families? Because families who feel like they belong, there's volunteerism, they want to donate, they have more trust for the organization, they will be the advocates out there for the school and the community with word of mouth, and they will be raving fans that are lifelong clients / customers who keep their kids in our schools. So, just to keep it simple, if people feel seen and valued and accepted for who they are, and they feel like they belong, then they're going to bring them their best selves. So let me hit you with that again. If your students, your teachers, your parents, if they feel seen and feel valued and feel accepted for who they are, they're going to show up as their best selves at school. And that's the power of a sense of belonging. That culture that you envisioned when you did your 5 senses activity, one of the ways you can get there is to just put that sense of belonging on steroids. So I realize that that's easy to say, but let me give you a couple of actions on how you can build a sense of belonging. I really think that one of the big keys is for you to be a visible and approachable leader, to build a sense of belonging, because a lot of this is tweaking. Things that you see and you're tweaking. You're providing lubrication for the machinery, oil for the machinery. You're adjusting this and you're adjusting that, and you're making sure this person feels seen and that this person isn't too grumpy, and just all of the little adjustments. I like to envision this giant sound system board with all the knobs on it. Those things terrify me. I don't know what I'm doing. But there are people who understand that at the big events, and they know exactly what knobs to turn and buttons to push. Well, as the leader, how are you going to know what to tweak, what knobs to turn, what buttons to push if you're not visible or approachable. And I'm not saying that you're choosing to stay in your office, but if you are a visible and approachable and credible leader, that is going to have a huge impact on the sense of belonging at your school. Another way that you can improve the sense of belonging is to check in on your teachers regularly and treat them as human beings first and employees second. And I've told you many times on the podcast that a non-negotiable for me was that hour of 30 minutes of recess and 30 minutes of lunch every single day, because my 4th through 8th grade teachers that I supervised, almost every one of them was on either recess duty or lunch duty. And when I would make my rounds and get some fresh air and be around laughing kids, and that would fill me up, I'd also be checking in on my teachers. And another how is to learn the kids' names and their stories. And I know that some of you are at small schools and some of you are at big schools. I talked to a leader the other day that's a division head that has 560 kids under their care. There's different levels of how reasonable it is for you to know all the kids' names in your school or in your division. But the more that you learn the kids' names and you learn their stories, who are they? What makes them tick? What do they like? And that goes back to being visible and being approachable and interacting. And it's easier for the kids that have been in your school longer. But I'm not saying that this is something that we can all achieve, but I think it's a goal that we shoot for, learning the kids' names and their stories. And then the last one would be how we're building a sense of belonging, is to position the parents at your school as partners, not visitors. Position your parents as partners, not visitors. I want you to think about that. Do your parents feel like visitors to the school, or do they feel like partners? And I'm not talking about whatever your procedure is. I think you should have great procedures, one point of entry. At our school, at the Jewish Day School, we had a thing where they had to run their ID through this thing called Raptor before they were even physically allowed into the building. I'm not talking about that part of it. I'm talking about just the general vibe of even before they come to school, while they're at the school. Do parents feel like partners, or do they feel like they're visitors or a bother or an inconvenience? We want them to have a sense of belonging as well. So that's a lot. I threw a lot at you today, and that's just part one. Because here's the thing. I want to just pause, give you a quick pep talk. Building the culture at your school is difficult and it takes a lot of work, but it's not impossible. And if you're stuck and you want this, what you need is a framework. And on part one today and part two next week, I'm giving you the framework, but I'm not saying it's going to be easy. This could take a couple of years of really hard work and getting other influencers on your staff involved and all the things. But if you keep your eyes on the prize, I've seen it. I've inherited a culture in a division that wasn't good at all, and we worked really hard, and then we created the culture that we envisioned, and it was awesome, and it was fun. And so I'm just trying to give you that pep talk that this feels like a lot, because it is a lot, but it's also possible, and it's possible for you to create or improve the culture at your school. So just the big takeaways, the 6 keys to significantly improving the culture at your school. At least what we covered today was prerequisite number 1, see it clearly, get your notebook, get to a quiet place where you won't be interrupted and do your 5 senses activity. Prerequisite number 2 is to read your mission and vision and portrait of a graduate, your guiding documents, and then ask yourself, are we in alignment? And if you're not, then you ask yourself, do we need to change our practice or our documents? And then key number 1 is to be the thermostat, not the thermometer. And we're going to accomplish that by the way we act and the way we speak. And then key number 2 is to climb the pyramid, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, by building psychological safety and a sense of belonging. So I'll take good care of you in the show notes. And then, like I said, we'll do keys 3 through 6 in episode 144 next week. And I like to end every episode with a call to action, and that is for you to do your 5 senses activity, to get a notebook, get a quiet place where you won't be interrupted, and just start envisioning what you see, what you hear, what you touch, what you smell, and what you taste in this ideal culture at your school, and capture it on paper or in a Google Doc. And then just a quick reminder about it's still not too late for you to purchase Parent Academy and get those 2 plug-and-play PDs and guided notes in front of your teachers so that you can start off the year and then reap the benefits of them having better relationships, better understanding, better strategies for working effectively with the parents at your school. And you can go to theprivateschoolleader.com/parentacademy to check that out. And then another quick reminder about this free guide that I have for you called The 7 Steps to Having Successful Meetings with Upset Parents. And that's free for you over at theprivateschoolleader.com/meeting. And then if you would just please share the podcast with another leader or rising leader at your school, I would really appreciate it. And the show notes for today's episode are at theprivateschoolleader.com/episode 143. And I appreciate you. I just am so grateful for you and all the amazing work that you're doing at your school. I've been your host, Mark Minkus, and thank you so much for taking some of your precious time to join me here today. And I'll see you next time right here on the Private School Leader Podcast. And until then, always remember to serve first, lead second, and make a difference.